PowerPlayChess, brought to you in association with Kagi. The standout game from round 6 of the Tata Steel Masters was Abdusattorov leading the tournament going into round 6 against the world champion Gukesh. They have had some epic battles in the past. You might remember their encounter from the Chennai Olympiad in 2022, which helped Uzbekistan to win the golds then. So here we go. Abdusattorov playing white, Gukesh playing black. Gioco piano, all normal. But now Abdusattorov plays a4. Well, it has been played before, but it's a very rare move. I mean, it looks bizarre to advance so early. But this kind of method of gaining space on the queen side, of course, is quite well known in the Gioco piano. But to play it on move 4 is certainly very unusual. But Abdusattorov and his second, Rustam Kazimjanov, must have prepared this, and they found some little new wrinkles in there. So there we go. He keeps going with a5. I mean, this is a very long-term strategy, this gaining space. And Gukesh decides to take advantage of the fact that this pawn has gone so far, so fast, by playing bishop b4 check. So obviously if c3, then black wins a pawn, so white has to play bishop d2, and black can exchange pieces. So that just calms things down a little bit once these bishops are exchanged from black's viewpoint. So, I mean, both sides, I suppose, could be happy. White has gained some space, but for black, there's no pressure on the center whatsoever. So he's free to maneuver. Knight e7, and of course this is a very typical idea, that the knight swings over to the kingside and, you know, might leap into this nice outpost here. Okay, rook e1 looks normal. That's often where you want to put the rook if you're going to go d4 particularly, because this pawn needs support. And knight h7. So Gukesh is not hanging around. He wants to get some initiative on the kingside. So potentially queen f6, and a knight f4 and knight g5 as well. Now I was just expecting Abdusattorov to play knight f1 here. And, you know, the knight could sit here to help defend the kingside. But he played rook e3 after almost 15 minutes. And, you know, this is unusual. But let's see one of the points. So knight g5 from Gukesh. This was exchanged. Now, I was thinking that black really wanted to take with the h-pawn. Now, this can be really useful if, you know, this knight manages to come here, g6, king g7, and you get an attack on the h-file. But white would play g3. You want to play queen h5, but then knight f4 is annoying. So you play g3, threatening queen h5, so that shuts out the knight. And if g4, then h3. This is one of the ideas. And if g takes h3, queen h5, and you never know. Well, white has a strong attack here. Queen takes knight is threatened. And one day, even g4 and rook h3 might happen. But no, I mean, knight f3 and knight g5 is certainly a consideration, you know, after something like this. And knight here and knight g5. So queen takes g5 played. Still, first glance seems quite nice for black, but g3. So I think the idea is just to kind of shut out this knight, basically. I know, I mean, these moves are possible, it's possible to play knight f4. But in this case, white is very solid here, and there's really nothing doing. So I think the idea of playing these moves like rook e3 and g3 is basically to stabilize the kingside, and then you're going to turn your attention to the other side of the board. But it's all based on very precise calculation. And, well, we see this after this move bishop g4, which certainly doesn't look bad. You know, I'd like to provoke f3, which, well, obviously queen takes rook in that case. But, yeah, we're going to see this move is possible in another position. But it's very interesting. Abdusattorov had something planned against this. He played h4. Now this, as I said, this relies on very precise calculation. So first of all, if queen takes rook, obviously pawn takes queen, bishop takes queen, so black wins material. But here, white has queen c2. So just stepping away from the bishop, and now black's queen is trapped. So you have to see that before you play h4. And if bishop takes queen, then, well, that's a very pleasant endgame for white, because black's kingside pawns have been damaged. Looks good. So queen h5. Now it's possible to play f3, but somehow, yeah, white's kingside looks a little bit weak. Queen b3 played. So now Abdusattorov is turning towards the queen side. He could have played in a milder way with bishop e2 and reached an endgame. I think that's quite pleasant for white, with just, you know, a little bit of space on the queen side. But queen b3 is more ambitious. And now b6 will run into trouble because of pressure on the a file and f7. So rook b8. Now knight f1. So basically these moves mean that black can't really contemplate some kind of sacrifice here. The knight and the rook are around the king. And that means that this knight is poorly placed on g6. So it dropped back to e7. Knight h2. Of course, white would like to take that bishop. The bishop drops back. Bishop e2. So the queen is driven away. So white's kingside is secure. Knight is slightly oddly placed on h2, although we'll see that it can actually move into the game very effectively. And Abdusattorov now takes control. Rook d1. Hitting the bishop. And this is really awkward for black. So if bishop c6, now we're going to see this knight hop into the game. How does black defend that pawn? It's very awkward. And that pawn just drops. So bishop e6 played. Queen b5 hits the e-pawn. Again, a little bit awkward for black. But f6 looks really ugly somehow. Because the king looks exposed. So knight c6 defends the pawn, but now a6. The a-pawn comes good. So white obviously trying to undermine the position of the knight on c6. And that's going to damage black's pawns. So bishop c8. The queen gets kicked again, and white gains some very nice space. Rook f3. The queen is still being pushed. And queen a4 played, which looks like a very natural move. You just want to damage these queenside pawns. You want to take here. In fact, rook d3, taking control over the d file, is the move the computer likes, and big advantage to white. But queen a4 also looks really good. To me, that looks very normal. Just to, yeah, you're looking to damage those queenside pawns. Knight d8, best move. Exchange on b7. So there's no doubt that white is better because these pawns are now split. But this is where Gukesh starts to fight back. So bishop c6 is a good move. Queen a7 not advised because of rook a8 winning the queen. So queen a2. Knight here. b4. So, I mean, if white can get a clamp on the queen side, then the structure is looking really nice. He's got to make sure that black isn't able to break out with one of these moves. But Gukesh has at least manoeuvred this knight to a good square. Still looks really nice for white. But yeah, there's a couple of sort of loosish pawns here that give black a little bit of counterplay. And rook a5. White is definitely better in this position. I think white just needs to gain control, and then it could be really nasty for black. But Gukesh is fighting back. So he decides now, instead of, hanging around waiting here with f6, which would really weaken the 7th rank, he goes for it with c5. This is definitely the best policy. And yes, if rook a7, then knight b5 hits the rook and the pawn. So pawn takes, and rook a7. Rook takes c3. So now we've got equal material and all the pawns on the king side, but Abdusattorov is still better here. Rook d7. So this is loose, and he wants to be able to take that pawn. And this is potentially rather unpleasant for black. Yeah, if knight c4, then that pin could be rather nasty. And you can see black's king is rather cramped. I think this is the problem. And that pawn on h5 doing a really good job, because, if the second rook could come in, then there could be a mating attack against the king on the 8th rank. So they reach the time control, and this is obviously unpleasant for black. But it's kind of on a knife edge, because, if white gets it wrong, then it could simplify very quickly to a draw. But white is very, very active here. So rook takes, no good, because of rook e8 hitting the knight. And white would have to give up the exchange. Should be a draw. So rook e7 guards the knight, so that's secure. Rook b4, counterplay, g4, so protecting this. Now, if rook takes the pawn in the middle, then knight takes f7. So rook h8, mate threatened, and the knight, very unpleasant. So this is what I mean when I say that this pawn on h5 cramps black's king and gives white the chance to go for a mating attack in some positions, like this. So rook c5 played. So just keeping an eye on that knight, so preventing this one. And if knight f7, then the king comes across, and, well, black has drawing chances in that position. But Abdusattorov plays more ambitiously, so he's guarded his pawns and still has pressure on f7. King f8. Rook takes. So now it's 2 pawns. However, there's trouble because the knight is threatened. The rook is under attack. Knight d3. So it's getting very tactical. Hitting a rook. So king takes and white takes one of those rooks, and white has a 2-pawn advantage. So rook b1 check. Rook c3. So the knight is attacked, has to come back to guard the rook. Rook b5. It's all very tactical now. Hitting the knight. So white has to give up a piece now. So rook takes g7, makes the most of it by taking another pawn. And rook a2. So if we look at the material balance, it's 3 pawns against a knight. But the big problem for black is that the king is really poorly placed. You know, these rooks obviously trap the king on the back rank at the moment, and yeah, rook a8 is threatened. So the king came across, hits the rook. Now, yeah, a piece can interpose on e8. So rook g6 still looks tremendous for white. I mean, if a 4th pawn goes, then that would be fantastic. If the knight defends passively, then, you know, white is really in control. I think, you know, the king will march up. Actually, knight g8, I mean, that actually loses on the spot to rook a8. So yeah, basically, this is necessary. So Gukesh is hanging on by his fingernails at this moment. If pawn takes, then black has just enough to hold that one. Because white's king isn't so well placed now. So rook e2. I tell you what, because it's so tactical, you know, it takes a lot of skill to play this position. You have to calculate incredibly well. Both sides have to. You know, it's absolutely on a knife edge, this position. So if white can take the knight and maintain the 2-pawn advantage, then it's winning for white. So rook g5. Now if rook takes knight, then black comes back and recovers that pawn, and it should be a draw. So rook takes h6. So now we're back with 3 pawns against the knight. Knight is threatened. Comes back to c5. Not a beautiful position. Moving away from the kingside. And rook c6. Excellent move. So pinning the knight. Getting a bit of distance from the king as well. So checks here are possible. Knight a4. The knight moving a long way from the king, which is dangerous. So white is gaining time. Rook a8 check. Another check. King moves up. And at this point, Abdusattorov played rook e8, which certainly looks good to start hassling the king. I'll come back to that position in a second. But after knight e6, in fact, Gukesh was okay. I mean, it's terribly close. Pawn is looking like it's going to run through, but watch this. Rook e5, it's the only move to draw. Gukesh starts a counterattack against the king. Rook a6, trying to prevent knight f4. And yeah, pinning. Rook check. And at this moment, they decided basically that's just a draw now. If the king steps up with king g3, you can see that this is a rather nasty counterattack. So with that move knight e6, there was just enough for Gukesh to make a draw. But let's go back to this position. The culprit was rook e8. It looks like a good move, but h6 was winning. That was the winning move. Just going for it. Okay, why is it winning? Well, if knight e6, this is a tricky one. h7, So you allow the knight check, but actually this is winning after, well, the rook has to go back to stop the pawn, and then rook here. And this check is just really nasty. I mean, it's not completely over, but basically white is getting there. Or if rook g8, rook c7, it's all tricky. And that's really unpleasant. Here, if the king goes back, then the pawns start rolling. King g5, and the knight can be taken. So h6 was the winning move. Very difficult to determine. h6 is correct. Rook e8 looks also really dangerous. That one was only good enough to draw. So an absolutely epic battle, as we've seen so often with these players. But Gukesh, I think actually this game showed the strength of these players very well. Abdusattorov, strategically, absolute maestro. But at the end, Gukesh wriggled out by calculating really well and showing his tactical skill. So after 6 rounds, in the lead, Abdusattorov and Pragyanananda on 4.5, and just behind Gukesh on 4 points. Round 7 is today, that's Saturday, and I'll see you with the next recording very soon. Thanks.